An empire that took 800 years to build is collapsing in a matter of decades. The legions no longer respond. The roads are empty. The cities that once housed 1 million people are now ruins inhabited by goats. And from the chaos that comes after, they are going to do something that no one expected. 1,000 years of history that will shape everything we are today. This is the Middle Ages complete. From the fall of Rome to the moment a Genoese sailor sets foot on land and changes the world forever. Stay, because what is going to happen in these 1,000 years is so brutal, so strange, and so fascinating that when you finish watching it, you are going to understand why we live as we live. The year is 476. Romulus Augustulus is 14 years old, and he is the last emperor of Western Rome. He was not deposed by another Roman. He was deposed by Odoacer, a Germanic warlord whom Rome itself had hired to defend itself. Look at him. He is signing his own abdication without fully understanding what it means. Odoacer does not even bother to proclaim himself emperor. He sends the imperial insignia to the emperor of the East and says, "We do not need them anymore." That gesture says it all. Rome did not fall in an epic battle. It fell because it stopped mattering to the people who were supposed to defend it. But let's be honest about something. Rome had been dying for centuries. The empire had been dividing power, ceding territory, and hiring barbarians to do the dirty work since the 3rd century. The so-called crisis of the 3rd century was almost a rehearsal for what came after. 50 years in which there were more than 20 emperors, most of them dead in a violent way. The empire survived that crisis, but it remained unrecognizable. The monetary economy collapsed in many regions. Cities shrank. People fled to the countryside, and when the final blow of the 5th century came, many in the provinces simply went on with their lives. For a peasant in Gaul or Hispania, the change from a Roman ruler to a Visigoth king was not necessarily a catastrophe. It was another lord demanding taxes with a different accent. What was a catastrophe was the loss of shared infrastructure. Rome had created something that did not exist before and that took centuries to reappear. A network of commerce, laws, and communication that connected from Scotland to Mesopotamia. When that broke, regions closed in on themselves. Skills were lost. There is archaeological evidence that in post-Roman Britannia, people stopped making pottery on a wheel for generations. They returned to Bronze Age techniques. That is what the collapse of a civilization really means. Not the battles or the speeches, but losing the knowledge of how to make a clay cup efficiently. Look at him. He is walking among the ruins of what was the Forum, which used to be the center of the known world. Now has grass growing between the stones. The statues are still standing, but no one knows who they are anymore. The documents that explained how all this worked are rotting in archives with no one to read them. Into this vacuum enter 2 forces that are going to dominate the next 1,000 years: the Christian Church and the Germanic kingdoms. And the story of how these 2 forces merge, clash, betray each other, and end up creating Europe is probably the most dramatic story of the last 2 millennia. The Church survived the fall of Rome because it had something the empire had lost: moral legitimacy. When imperial officials disappeared, the bishop stayed. In many cities, the bishop was the only authority left, the only one who knew how to read contracts, mediate conflicts, organize food distribution. Look at him. In Carthage, in Lyon, in Toledo. The bishop receives the new Germanic lords and explains to them how this works. The barbarians needed that legitimacy. The church had it. The deal was made almost by itself. The kingdoms that arose on the ruins of Western Rome are what we call the Romano-Germanic world today. The Visigoths in Hispania, the Franks in Gaul, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Anglo-Saxons in Britannia, each with its own laws, customs, original gods, but all gradually absorbing Latin, Roman law, and Christianity. This process of cultural fusion is fascinating because neither side came out the same. The Germanics adopted the Roman religion, but brought with them a radically different vision of the world for them. Personal loyalty, war as a supreme value, and individual charismatic leadership were the center of everything. Rome had been a state. The Germanic kingdoms were networks of personal loyalties. That difference is going to define European politics for centuries. In the 6th century, there is a character who summarizes all this in an extraordinary way. There is a man in Britannia who may be real or may be legendary, probably a mix of both, whose story perfectly encapsulates this moment of transition. We call him Arthur. And although the Arthur of the legends with medieval castles and tournaments is completely anachronistic, there is something behind the myth that does have historical roots. There were British Romanized leaders who resisted the Saxon invasions in the 5th and 6th centuries. There were battles. There was someone or several whose resistance remained etched in the collective memory. The legend of Arthur is the dream of Rome that does not want to die. The desire that someone, some just king with a round table where everyone is equal, can restore the lost order. That dream will haunt Europe throughout the Middle Ages, while in the West everything fragments. In the East something very different happens. The Eastern Roman Empire did not fall in 476. It continued for another 973 years until 1453. We call it the Byzantine Empire, but they never called themselves that. They were the Romans, the authentic ones, the ones who had preserved the flame. And to a certain extent they were right. Constantinople in the 6th century was the largest, richest, and most sophisticated city in the Western world. Its inhabitants spoke Greek, but they thought in Roman terms. Their law was Roman. Their architecture was amplified Roman. The Hagia Sophia, built in the year 537, is perhaps the most ambitious building of the entire Middle Ages. A dome 31 meters in diameter that seems to float over the interior space because light enters through a row of windows at the base and makes the dome seem suspended in the air. It is an engineering trick that would not be repeated in the West for centuries. The emperor who built the Hagia Sophia was Justinian, and Justinian deserves to be remembered as one of the most ambitious and contradictory figures in all of history. In one hand, he had the dream of restoring the complete Roman Empire, reconquering the West, unifying the Mediterranean world. In the other, he had the largest legal compilation of antiquity, the Corpus Juris Civilis, a systematic compilation of all Roman law that his lawyers took years to compile and that today remains the basis of civil law in half the world. Justinian reconquered northern Africa, Italy, and part of Hispania. For a moment, it seemed that the dream was possible, but the campaigns exhausted the treasury. The wars in the east against Persia did not stop, and a devastating plague, known as the Plague of Justinian, spread through the Mediterranean starting in the year 542, killing, according to estimates, between a quarter and half of the population of the affected areas. It is the first documented pandemic in history, and it was terrifying. Entire cities were left empty. Crops rotted in the fields because there was no one to harvest them. The empire survived, but it never regained the capacity to maintain its conquests in the West, while Byzantium struggled to survive. In an arid peninsula to the south and east of the Mediterranean, something was germinating that no one in Rome, Constantinople, or the Germanic kingdoms could have anticipated. In the year 610, a 40-year-old Arab merchant named Muhammad began to receive what he described as revelations. In 22 years, he transformed Arabia. In 100 years after his death in the year 632, his followers had built the most extensive empire the world had seen until then. From the Indus to the Pyrenees, Islam is one of the most extraordinary phenomena of human history and deserves to be treated with the seriousness it deserves. It was not just a military conquest, it was a cultural, intellectual, and spiritual revolution of the First Order that shifted the axis of the known world. Look at her, the Arab cavalry crossing the desert at a speed that no one had seen before. They move at night to avoid the heat. Their horses do not need the water that Roman horses need. They know the terrain. In 10 years, they have overthrown the Persian Empire, which had been the dominant power in Western Asia for 3 centuries. Then they turned toward the Byzantine Empire in the year 636 in the Battle of Yarmouk. An Arab army defeated the Byzantine forces in one of the most decisive battles of history. The causes of the Byzantine collapse before Islam are complex. The exhaustion of the Persian wars, the alienation of the eastern provinces due to theological disputes over the nature of Christ, the charisma and extraordinary discipline of the first Islamic armies. In a few years, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and northern Africa were under Islamic control. Egypt, which had been the granary of the Mediterranean for 1,000 years, ceased to be so for Byzantium. That single fact completely restructured the economy of the Mediterranean world. The Islamic empire that emerged from these conquests, the Umayyad Caliphate and later the Abbasid, was for 2 centuries the most advanced civilization in the world. It is not an exaggeration. In mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and literature, the medieval Islamic world had no rival. While in the post-Roman Western Europe, the majority of the population was illiterate, and life expectancy was brutally short. In Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo, hospitals operated, libraries with hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, schools of astronomy, and translation academies where the works of Aristotle, Plato, Galen, and Euclid were preserved and expanded. Without Islam, much of the classical Greek knowledge would have been lost forever. Europe recovered it centuries later, in part through Latin translations of Arabic texts. In the year 711, an Islamic army crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. It entered Hispania, and in 3 years had overthrown the Visigoth kingdom that had been established for 3 centuries. The speed was astonishing. Not everyone resisted. Many Visigoth nobles negotiated their survival. The Jewish communities that had suffered persecution under the Visigoth kings, in many cases welcomed the new lords with relief. Al-Andalus, which is the Arabic name for Islamic Hispania, became one of the most sophisticated and multicultural places in the medieval world. Cordoba in the 10th century possibly had between 200,000 and 300,000 inhabitants. It was the most populous city in Western Europe with aqueducts, pavement in the streets, public lighting, dozens of libraries, and a mosque that still today, after the Castilian kings put a cathedral in the middle, continues to be one of the most beautiful buildings ever built. But the Islamic advance in Europe did not continue indefinitely. In the year 732, in a place between Tours and Poitiers in northern Gaul, a Frankish army under the command of Charles Martel stopped an Islamic raid in what many consider one of the turning points of Western history. The battle was real, but its significance has been systematically exaggerated. It was not a total invasion that was going to Islamize Europe. It was probably a large-scale looting raid. But what was real is that it signaled the limit of Islamic expansion to the north and established the Franks as the dominant power in Western Europe. Charles Martel is the grandfather of Charlemagne, and Charlemagne is perhaps the most important character of the entire Western Middle Ages. Here we must stop because what this man does in 40 years of reign is unprecedented since Augustus. He is in Aachen, his capital, and around him are bishops, abbots, grammarians, poets, geographers. He is building something new with the bricks of something old. They call it the Carolingian Renaissance, and that label is not exaggerated. Charlemagne unified under his control most of Western Europe, France, Germany, Austria, northern Italy, part of Spain. In the year 800, Pope Leo III crowned him Emperor of the Romans in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. That moment is one of the most loaded with symbolism in all of Western history. The Roman Empire was reborn in theory. In practice, what Charlemagne built was radically different from Rome. It was a Germanic Christian empire that used the language of Rome as legitimation, but that functioned according to completely different principles. His empire did not have a professional bureaucracy like Rome. It depended on counts, local lords, who administered territories in the name of the emperor. When the emperor was strong, the system worked. When he was weak, the counts did what they wanted. This tension between central power and local powers will define European politics for the next 800 years. Charlemagne also did something that seems minor, but that was transformative. He ordered the standardization of writing. The Carolingian minuscule script, which his scribes developed and disseminated, is the direct basis of the alphabet you are reading right now. Without the Carolingian educational reform, which ordered that every monastery and every cathedral have a school, the level of illiteracy in Western Europe would be even more catastrophic than it already was. It did not become a literate society overnight, but at least it created infrastructure so that knowledge would survive. The empire of Charlemagne lasted exactly as long as it took him to die. In the year 843, the Treaty of Verdun divided the empire among his 3 grandsons into 3 parts that correspond approximately to present-day France, present-day Germany, and the present-day Low Countries. This division is not casual. It defines the cultural and linguistic borders of Western Europe for the following 12 centuries. And for me, this treaty is one of the most underrated moments in history. The day that Europe decided to be plural instead of united, although no one planned it that way. While Charlemagne's heirs fought over the remains of the empire, Europe was being attacked from 3 directions simultaneously. From the north, the Vikings; from the south and the east, the Saracens and the Magyars. The 9th and 10th centuries are perhaps the most brutal period of the Western Middle Ages. The chronicles describe constant attacks, famines, cities sacked and burned. And in this context of terror and fragmentation, the system we call feudalism was born. Look at it. The horizon is on fire. There are wooden ships with dragon-shaped prows coming up the river. They row slowly, methodically. The men on the shore have time to hear, but they do not know where. There are no walls. There is no army coming to help them. There is only a local lord with his men-at-arms and a promise, protection in exchange for loyalty and work. Feudalism was not a system designed by anyone. It arose spontaneously as a response to the inability of kings to protect their subjects. If the king cannot defend you, you look for someone who can. If that someone defends you, you owe him loyalty, work, and a part of your harvest. It is a chain of dependencies that goes from the peasant to the local lord, from the local lord to the count, from the count to the king. And in each link of the chain there are rights and obligations, although rarely fulfilled with precision. The medieval documents that describe these relationships are sometimes of shocking crudeness. The lord can do this and this with his serfs. The serf cannot marry without permission. He cannot move from the territory. It is not slavery in the strict sense, but it is not freedom either. The Vikings are one of the most fascinating stories of this period. We imagine them as brutal warriors, and in part they were. But reducing them to that is missing the most interesting thing. The Vikings were also the most daring explorers, traders, and colonizers of the High Middle Ages. The Norwegians colonized Iceland in the 9th century, Greenland in the 10th, and arrived in North America to a place they called Vinland around the year 1000, 500 years before Columbus. This is not speculation. The excavations at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland have confirmed Viking settlements from approximately the year 1000. The Swedes went down the rivers of Russia and Ukraine, founded Kiev, and arrived by ship in Constantinople, where they served as the emperor's personal guard in the famous Varangian Guard. The Danes established the Kingdom of Normandy in the north of France, and that small piece of data has colossal consequences because the descendants of those Normanized Vikings are going to conquer England in 1066. The year 1000 is one of those moments that romantic historiography turned into apocalyptic. The whole of Europe was supposed to be waiting for the end of the world with the turn of the millennium. Peasants abandoning their fields, nobles donating their lands to monasteries for fear of the final judgment. That image is almost completely false. Medieval documents show a completely normal economic activity around the year 1000. No one seems especially more hysterical than usual. But what is real is that the 11th and 12th centuries were the period of greatest transformation and vitality of the High Middle Ages. Europe started to grow. The climate helped. Between the 9th and 13th centuries, Europe enjoyed what climatologists call the medieval warm period, a period of warmer temperatures that allowed vineyards to be grown in Scotland and England, which increased agricultural yields and fueled sustained population growth. The population of Western Europe doubled between the year 1000 and 1300. Cities that had been villages became commercial centers. The Champagne fairs became the central node of European trade, connecting the Mediterranean with the North Sea. Money returned to circulation. Trade routes reopened. In this context of growth and renewed confidence, something emerged that defined medieval culture like no other institution: the monastery. Look at it. It is at the bottom of the valley. In the morning mist, there is a bell that calls the monks to lauds before dawn. Inside those walls, there is a scriptorium where several men copy manuscripts in silence. There's a garden of medicinal plants, a library, a school for the sons of the local nobles, a metal workshop, a mill. Medieval monasteries were not just places of prayer. They were the most complex and multifunctional institutions of their time. Simultaneously, universities, hospitals, agricultural research centers, banks, and an archive of the cultural memory of civilization. The Benedictine order, founded by Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century, with its rule that balanced prayer and manual labor. Ora et labora was the model that spread throughout Europe, but in the 10th century, a reform emerged that shook the monastic world. The Order of Cluny, with its headquarters in Burgundy, imposed a network of monasteries directly subordinate to the Pope that escaped the control of local lay lords. This was revolutionary because it created the first truly pan-European organization since the Roman Empire, and it was also the beginning of a tension that is going to dominate medieval politics. Who was in charge in Europe, the Pope or the Emperor? This tension erupted in what is known as the investiture controversy. The technical question seems minor. Can a king appoint bishops in his territory? In practice, it was a question about who really controlled power. The bishops were simultaneously religious leaders and feudal lords with vast territories, armies, and resources. Controlling who was a bishop meant controlling power. The conflict reached its most dramatic point in January of the year 1077, when the German king and Emperor Henry IV crossed the Alps in the middle of winter to appear before the castle of Canossa in northern Italy, where Pope Gregory VII was. Henry had been excommunicated. Excommunication in the Middle Ages was not just a spiritual matter. It freed all his vassals from their oath of loyalty. His empire was crumbling. For 3 days, Henry IV waited barefoot in the snow before the gates of the castle until the Pope received him and lifted the excommunication. It is one of the most powerful scenes in all of medieval history. The most powerful man in Western Europe humiliated before an old man who had no armies, only the moral authority of the keys of Saint Peter. But the church that Gregory VII reformed was not just a spiritual institution. It was also a political, economic, and military power that accumulated power with an efficiency that would have made emperors envious. And in 1095, that power was used to launch something that today seems incomprehensible to us, and that at the time mobilized hundreds of thousands of people. The First Crusade. Pope Urban II preached at the Council of Clermont in November of 1095. The Byzantine Empire was being pressured by the Seljuk Turks, who had taken Anatolia and were threatening Constantinople. Jerusalem, the most sacred city of Christianity, was under Islamic control. Urban called on the European knights to march to the east, to defend their Christian brothers and to liberate the Holy Sepulchre. And what happened next was one of the most surprising collective mobilization phenomena in history. Look at them. They are thousands and thousands of men marching along dusty roads. There are knights in armor. There are peasants with farm tools turned into weapons. There are women and children. They have abandoned their homes, their fields, their families, Some do not even know exactly where they are going. They have heard the preacher's sermon, and something in them has been ignited that they can no longer turn off. Before the official army of Crusader Knights was even organized, a mass of peasants under the command of a preacher named Peter the Hermit marched to the east in what is known as the People's Crusade. They arrived in the Byzantine Empire in disorder, looting what they found along the way, including Jewish communities in the Rhine, which were massacred in what is known as the Rhine Massacres of 1096, one of the first great pogroms in European history. When they finally crossed into Turkish territory, they were almost completely annihilated. The army of knights that followed was different. They were professional warriors, well equipped, with combat experience that the Turks did not expect. In July of 1099, they took Jerusalem in an assault that the chronicles describe with details of extreme violence. The Crusaders established the Kingdom of Jerusalem and several smaller states, the so-called Crusader states, which survived with difficulties for 2 centuries, thanks to a constant supply of new warriors from Europe and the support of military orders like the Templars and the Hospitallers. The Crusades are complex and cannot be reduced to heroes and villains. There is in them genuine faith, brutal greed, real heroism, and documented atrocities. But their most lasting impact was not military, but cultural and economic. The contact with Islam, through the Crusades, accelerated the transmission of Arabic knowledge to Europe. Arabic mathematics, Arabic medicine, Aristotelian philosophy and Arabic version arrived in Europe in part through the contacts that the Crusades generated. Spices, silks, and aromas from the Eastern Mediterranean created a demand in Europe that fueled trade for centuries. And that trade was the engine of the rise of the Italian cities, especially Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, which became the commercial powers of the medieval Mediterranean. Venice in the 12th and 13th centuries is one of the most extraordinary creations of political history. It was not a kingdom. It was not an empire. It was a commercial republic governed by merchants with a system of election of the Doge that included draws and votes in a deliberately complicated sequence to prevent any family from accumulating too much power. It was also absolutely ruthless in the defense of its commercial interests. In 1204, Venice manipulated the armies of the Fourth Crusade so that instead of going to the Holy Land, they attacked and sacked Constantinople, the richest Christian city in the world, a commercial rival of Venice for decades. That sacking was one of the most devastating blows that the Byzantine Empire ever suffered. It never fully recovered. In the 12th century, Western Europe was transforming at a speed that was unprecedented since Rome. Cities grew, trade grew, and from the cathedral schools something completely new was emerging. The first universities, Bologna in 1088, Paris around 1150, Oxford shortly after. These institutions were a radical innovation. For the first time, there were places where knowledge was not only preserved, but actively questioned and debated according to formal methods, scholasticism. The intellectual method that dominated medieval universities was basically a form of philosophical reasoning applied to theological questions. Thomas Aquinas, its greatest figure, built in the 13th century a synthesis between Aristotelianism and Christian thought, which is still the official philosophy of the Catholic Church today. What I find fascinating about scholasticism is that under a facade of deference to authority, it actually establishes the primacy of human reason as a tool to understand the world. It is a crucial step toward modernity, although its authors did not see it that way. The 13th century starts with the most ambitious pontificate of medieval history. Innocent III takes papal power to its peak. He overthrows emperors, launches crusades, convenes the Fourth Lateran Council, which redefines Catholic doctrine, establishes the Inquisition as a permanent institution, and directs the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars of southern France, which is basically a war of extermination against a Christian heresy with a component of land appropriation so obvious that it is difficult not to see it. Innocent was a man of brilliant intelligence and limitless ambition. His reign also shows the cost of that power. When the church becomes a political power of the first magnitude, it starts to lose the moral authority that was its true asset. In Central Asia, in the same 13th century, something is happening that Europe takes time to understand, but that is going to arrive with devastating brutality. Temujin, who unified the Mongol tribes and adopted the title of Genghis Khan, around 1206 created the most extensive empire by surface area in human history in a few decades. The Mongols destroyed the empire of the Jurchen in China, the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, conquered Russia, and reached Poland and Hungary in 1241. The sacking of Baghdad in 1258 was a cultural catastrophe of the first magnitude. The city that had been the intellectual center of the Islamic world for 500 years was destroyed. Libraries were burned. The Tigris, they say, ran black with ink and red for days. That may be chroniclers' exaggeration, but the scale of the disaster is not. The Islamic Caliphate as a political institution never recovered. The Mongols reached the gates of Western Europe and then stopped. The exact reason for this stopping has been debated intensely. It may have been the death of Ogedei Khan in 1241 that forced the Mongol generals to return to the east for the election of the successor. It may be that the Hungarian geography, with fewer grasslands than the Asian steppes, made it difficult to maintain the Mongol cavalry armies. It was probably a combination of factors. But the fact is that Western Europe did not experience the direct Mongol devastation that destroyed entire civilizations in Asia and the Middle East. What it did experience decades later was something the Mongols carried inside them without knowing it. Merchant ships entering the port of Messina in Sicily in October of 1347. They come from Crimea. They have in their holds something that the sailors already know is deadly, but that they cannot identify. A few days later, on the dock, the first symptoms: fever, buboes under the armpits and in the groin, the skin blackening on the extremities. In weeks, Messina is terrified. People flee, and with the people the rats, and with the rats the fleas, and with the fleas the bacteria Yersinia pestis. The Black Death is the greatest demographic disaster in the documented history of Western civilization. Between 1347 and 1353, it killed between a third and half of the population of Europe. In some regions, the mortality was even higher. There are villages that simply disappeared. In Florence, which had 90,000 inhabitants before the plague, fewer than 50,000 remained in 1350. The chronicles describe scenes of daily apocalypse, the dying in the streets, bodies piled up because there were not enough living to bury the dead, priests who refused to administer the last sacraments for fear of contagion, parents abandoning their sick children. The psychological impact was as brutal as the demographic one. Death stopped being something abstract and distant to become a constant and inevitable presence. The art of the second half of the 15th century is obsessed with death, the dance of death. That artistic motif where skeletons lead popes, emperors, beggars, and children by the hand. It arises directly from the collective experience of the plague. No one escapes. Death equals everyone. That is a subversive and terrifying message in a society that bases its political order on the sacred inequality of the estates. But the economic and social impact was deeper than it seems at first glance. With the death of a third of the population, labor became scarce. The peasants who survived suddenly had a bargaining power they had never had. In many regions of Europe, they demanded and achieved better conditions. Reduction of feudal obligations, freedom of movement. The lords who refused faced revolts. The Jacquerie in France in 1358. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. These movements were crushed, but not without consequences. The feudal system was damaged irreversibly by the Black Death. Demography accelerated a process of economic liberation that had taken centuries to brew. In the same era, in the middle of the 15th century, Europe was tearing itself apart in the longest conflict of its medieval history. The 100 Years' War between France and England began technically in 1337 and ended in 1453. although with interruptions. Its origin is in the dynastic claims of the English kings over the French throne, complicated by decades of cross-marriages and contested inheritances. But the story of this war cannot be told without speaking of a character who is, in my opinion, one of the most fascinating of all medieval history, Joan of Arc. Joan was 16 or 17 years old when she appeared before the Dauphin Charles of France in 1429. France was being defeated. The English controlled the north of the country, including Paris. The king himself was an indecisive man who doubted even his own legitimacy. And this girl from eastern France arrived saying that she heard voices of saints that ordered her to expel the English and crown the king in Reims. Most of the king's advisors wanted to kick her out. What amazes me is that the king listened to her and that she did exactly what she promised. In a matter of months, Joan of Arc lifted the siege of Orleans, which had been going on for months without being able to be broken, and led the French army in a series of victories that completely changed the balance of the war. Charles was crowned in Reims. The momentum changed. Joan was captured by the Burgundians in 1430, sold to the English, judged by an ecclesiastical tribunal for heresy, and burned in Rouen in 1431 at 19 years old. The trial was a judicial scandal of the first order with predetermined judges, without a defense lawyer, with an accused who answered trap questions with an intelligence and firmness that impressed even her judges. The conviction was politically necessary for the English, because if Joan was a true prophet, her victories were divinely sanctioned, and the English cause was lost. If she was a heretic and witch, her victories were the work of the 25 years later, with the English already expelled from France. The Pope annulled the trial. 500 years later, she was canonized. The story of Joan of Arc is the story of an illiterate rural girl who changed the outcome of a war and was destroyed by it. The 100 Years' War accelerated something crucial: the construction of modern national states. France emerged from the war with a sense of national identity that did not exist before. The common enemy had created something new. The French kings took advantage of the political capital of the victory to centralize power, create permanent armies, reduce the autonomy of the nobles. The modern state, with its monopoly on legitimate violence and its bureaucratic apparatus, has its roots in the Europe of the 15th century, in Eastern Europe. The history of this period has another rhythm and other protagonists. The Mongol Empire fragmented, but its heirs continued to be a huge force. The Golden Horde dominated the steppes north of the Black Sea for centuries. And in Anatolia, a small Turkish state founded by a chief named Osman, at the beginning of the 15th century was growing slowly, absorbing territories, adapting its institutions, combining the Islamic tradition with elements of Byzantine and Persian government. The Ottomans, as the dynasty of Osman was known, had something that most medieval states did not have: an extraordinary capacity to integrate the peoples they conquered. The Janissaries, the Ottoman military elite, were mostly captured and converted Christians. The Ottoman Empire was multi-ethnic and multi-religious in a way that had no equivalent in the Western Europe of the period. In 1453, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, who was 21 years old, did what no one had achieved in 1,000 years. He took Constantinople. The siege lasted 53 days. The last defenders, Greeks and Venetians, fought with desperate ferocity. The last emperor, Constantine XI, died fighting on the walls. No one knows where his remains are. He did not surrender. The walls that Theodosius II had built in the 5th century and that had held for 1,000 years gave way to Ottoman artillery. Mehmed entered the city on horseback and went directly to the Hagia Sophia, which he converted into a mosque. The fall of Constantinople formally closed the Eastern Roman Empire. Rome in all its forms had ended. Look at it. The dome of the Hagia Sophia is intact, still standing after 916 years in there. Under that light that enters through the windows of the base and makes everything seem to float, people are praying in Arabic, outside, in the streets. The world is changing in ways that no one in that city can yet fully comprehend. The consequences of the fall of Constantinople were immediate and far-reaching. The Greek scholars who escaped brought with them manuscripts, classical Greek texts that in Western Europe only existed in fragmentary Latin translations, now arrived in their original version. Greek began to be taught in Italian universities. Humanism, which was already developing in Italy with figures like Petrarch and Boccaccio, found in these texts a new fuel. The Italian Renaissance did not begin in 1453, but that year was a powerful accelerator. The Renaissance is one of those concepts that is used so loosely that it has lost precision, but that describes something real, a profound transformation in the way Europeans saw themselves in the world. Renaissance humanism put the individual human being, his capacities, his dignity, his potential for creation, at the center of thought. This is not necessarily anti-religious. Many humanists were deeply believing, but it is different from the medieval vision, where the individual was above all a soul in transit to eternity, and earthly life was a fleeting test. The Renaissance artist signs his works. The medieval artist usually does not. That small difference says everything. But there is another transformation of the 15th century that is going to change the world more profoundly than the Renaissance, more than the fall of Constantinople, more than any political or military event. The movable type printing press of Johannes Gutenberg, perfected around 1445 before Gutenberg. A book was an extremely expensive object that required months of work from a copyist. Only the richest institutions, monasteries, universities, royal courts could have libraries. The majority of the population never touched a book in their entire life. In 1455, Gutenberg's press produced the first printed Bible. In 50 years, there were hundreds of printing presses throughout Europe, and millions of copies of thousands of different texts had been produced. Knowledge ceased to be a monopoly of the elites. Ideas could now travel at an unprecedented speed and scale. Luther's Protestant Reformation, half a century later, is unthinkable without the printing press. The scientific and political revolutions of the following centuries are unthinkable without the printing press. Gutenberg did not just invent a machine, he invented the information age 400 years before anyone used those words. In the Iberian Peninsula, the 15th century is the scene of a process that had been developing since the 10th century, and that accelerated dramatically. The Reconquista. The term Reconquista is controversial because it implies a continuity and an intentionality that historical reality complicates. The medieval Iberian kingdoms were not a unified project of territorial recovery. They were multiple states with frequently contradictory interests, but the result was real. For 400 years, the Christian kingdoms of the north were expanding toward the south at the expense of the Islamic Emirates. Toledo fell in 1085, Cordoba in 1236, Sevilla in 1248, in 1492, the last Islamic kingdom on the peninsula. The Emirate of Granada fell to the armies of Ferdinand and Isabella. 150,000 people, according to the most conservative estimates, were forced to choose between conversion and exile. It is one of the most brutal acts of religious intolerance in European medieval history, and its economic consequences for Castile were also devastating. Since the Jewish community included some of the most capable merchants, doctors, translators, and financiers in the kingdom, it was a political error, in addition to a moral atrocity, although that category did not exist in the minds of those who ordered it. And also that year, that same extraordinary year of 1492, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus arrived in the Bahamas believing that he had reached Asia and began what in historical terms can only be described as the greatest clash of civilizations in human history. The encounter between the Atlantic American world and the Euro-African and Asian world that had been developing separately for at least 10,000 years. That moment closes the Middle Ages, not because history changes overnight, because it does not. The peasants of northern France in 1493 continued living in a way very similar to the peasants of the year 900. but because it opens a world of possibilities and transformations that makes everything previous recognizably different from what comes after. 1,000 years. From a 14-year-old boy signing his abdication in Rome to a sailor looking at a beach that does not appear on any map. In that interval, the Western world died and was reborn several times. It lost the Roman Empire and built something completely different on its ruins. It saw Islam arise and was almost consumed by it. It built cathedrals that still leave us speechless. It lost a third of its people to a plague and kept going. It created universities, the printing press, the national states, and commercial capitalism before any of these concepts existed by that name. The Middle Ages was not the dark age that the Renaissance invented to make itself brighter by contrast. It was an era of extraordinary complexity, creativity, and brutality, an era that left us most of the institutions that define the modern world. Its contradictions are ours. Its questions about power, faith, justice, and knowledge are the ones we continue trying to answer. And Romulus, Augustulus, the boy who signed the abdication of the last empire, retired to a villa in Campania and, according to the chronicles, lived for years on a pension paid for by the new lord of the world. History sometimes has an irony that no fiction could improve.